Hi, I am Tony Russo from On Deathcare, and this is The Rest, your weekly roundup of industry news. This week we're going to take another brief look at the Foundation Partners changes at the top and another look at the lawsuit that we mentioned last week about the mistaken cremation or the miscremation of bodies. Plus, we have more updates on funeral scam in Connecticut that is still in the courts, and lots of other stuff to get to, including, one of the a pageant person is also a mortuary school student. So before we get into all that, I do want to take a second to thank my paid subscribers. If you have not subscribed, please go to ondeathcare.com and you can subscribe to this newsletter. You can subscribe at multiple levels. And of course, I'd like to shout out our paid subscribers who help keep the lights on and keep things running around here. It's important to me that you value this work with your actual money. And if you do have the means, I would really appreciate it if you became a paid subscriber. More on that at the end of this. Right now, let's get into the news. Last week, we reported that there was a rumor that there had been a change at the top at Foundation Partners. It turns out that rumor is mostly true. There is a new CEO. His name is Jim Evinger. He is a professional interim CEO, which makes everything else that came out of Foundation Partners this week just a little confusing. So they sent out a press release apparently on Friday night, and it said that, Jim Evinger was the new CEO and thanked John Smith for his service. The tone of the press release made it sound as if John Smith was hired specifically to get the company sold, and now they've brought in, Mr. Evinger as a more permanent CEO. It doesn't say that in the newsletter. That's, again, just the impression I got, which is counter to the other impressions. The one that I think is the most important is that, John Smith was talking about changing the culture at Foundation Partners to one from, buying EBITDA, as he put it, to building better companies among the funeral homes that they bought. And I believe that was kind of the plan. In August, you'll recall that there was a bunch of some funeral people brought on as advisors, as community advisors, but they're still banker heavy for sure in the C-suite. And so it's an interesting call, and it's an interesting pick. This is the second CEO in a row, I believe, third if you count one of the other interims, with literally no funeral service experience. And I don't, as I mentioned in the column on Sunday, I don't know why that's their plan at Foundation Partners. But I guess we'll see if this is really an interim thing or if we are going to have Mr. Evinger with us for a while. But there's a link to their release in the show notes. And so kind of along those lines, first of all, I guess it's worth mentioning that I did do kind of a deep dive on the Foundation Partners deal and its implications for my, paid subscribers for the weekly Sunday column. So if you're interested in that, being a paid subscriber is a good way to get access to it. But for all subscribers, I also did a story last week about Milestone and about private money in general in funeral service and how it is looked at, how it can be looked at, and sort of like the weird balance. And one of the things that I hit upon in that story, which is linked in the show notes, is this notion that it's not so much, the what as it is the who. So when I spoke with Mike Martell about, people's concerns about private equity, his response was essentially, I'm a funeral director. I do funeral director first. I'm also a company owner, and we've got a long-term commitment from our funding partners because there is a plan, and that plan is to help grow the businesses that we have. And that's when, the whole John Smith thing happened. And he was saying, we're going to stop doing all of this private equity kind of turn and burn with the, buying revenue, and we're going to settle this. And that's why I thought it was really important to kind of bring this story up again, because it's an interesting way to think about how funeral home transactions happen. And, I think a lot of independent funeral home owners, for very good reason, and many of them have reached out to me, are ambivalent at best about private equity money. But I think what we're going to start to see now as it moves in, and it is just a really big part of a lot of these small to mid-sized consolidators, that it's going to be more relationship. It's going to be more the who and what you think is going to happen to your business after you sell it to the people you sell it to. So there's a link to that story in the show notes, and I think it helps bring context to the foundation partner stuff. And kind of an interesting and vaguely sadder note this week on another story we talked about last week, which is the lawsuit with the Tid Funeral Home. If you haven't heard the story, just really quickly, a woman came in and made very elaborate and specific final arrangements that included having her husband exhumed, having her put unembalmed into the casket with her husband, with her in a particular nightgown, wearing her wedding ring, with her head on his shoulder, and this person was cremated instead. They're being sued for $7 million, the funeral home. And so they came out with a statement this week that said, in the best possible way, I know I'm a flippant person sometimes, but it said, we can only say we're sorry so much, and we're not against, paying for our tragic mistake, but $7 million will break us. $7 million is an order to close. They said that they've done more than 4,500 cremations and have never had an incident like this. The other thing that they said that was really interesting is that they fired the guy that made the deal like almost immediately. Like, they're no longer working with Preneed salespeople that overpromise on things that they don't need to deliver. And that is an interesting story in and of itself. If you have a story about a Preneed salesperson that was overpromising because that salesperson didn't have to be involved in the delivery of it, I would love to hear that story. So please reach out to me through the website. You can email me. My email address, I'll give it at the end, but right now it is by Tony Russo at gmail.com. That is BYTonyRusso@gmail.com. But I have to give the Tid Funeral Home credit for their forthrightness in accepting responsibility immediately. And everything they did was textbook what you should do if you do something that is irreparable when you're holding a funeral service. So we'll see how this works out. I also had a really interesting chat with Barbara Kemis this week about not how this happens, but kind of how this kind of thing may kind of happen. I don't want to give away too much, but I'll have a story about that out before the end of the week, I think, and I'll mail that to subscribers. So again, another good reason to subscribe, because Barbara Kemis has a really important tip on how you can go a long way toward preventing disaster in the crematory. So anyway, everything else, link in the show notes. Philip Petris, who is the former owner of a Connecticut funeral home chain, has been offered a plea deal regarding charges that he stole more than $1 million from more than 100 families. The plea deal is weird. I'm sorry, the plea deal is not public. It's not a deal, it's an offer, and a lot of times they don't make the offer public, and in this case they haven't. I reached out to the state's attorney's office, but what's really, I guess, somewhat troubling about this is he's going to go to each of the 120 families and explain to them what they're hoping to get done with this with this plea deal. And I think, again, just from the tone and context of all the reporting I've read, I think he's got some not great news for them. The way a lot of times these awful financial crimes work is that the people who do the stealing can then kind of hold the money ransom. I mean, he's looking at like 800 years in jail, something like literally 800 years in jail. If for each felony is like 20 years or something, maximum of 20 years. And so, the people who were affected are calling for 20 years. They're calling for at least, 10 years. Like, they're already just hoping that this guy sees the inside of a jail cell. And I think that the plea deal is going to emphasize more on selling his assets and making the victims whole rather than, having him use his assets to pay his lawyers to still end up in jail and not making the families whole. There is legislation in Connecticut that has passed that will help make the families of the defrauded whole in the case of, a Preneed failure like this. And there's more stuff that's going on in Connecticut. I've mentioned before, there's a public service announcement that was done by Bailey Funeral Homes that's just like, this is how, how to be careful, how to protect yourself against these kinds of scams. But we'll see. This is going to be 3 months. So they gave him 3 months to review the deal, and the the state's attorney rather, has 3 months to try to get the families on board with the deal as well. And if everybody is on board with the deal, then they'll be back in court on September 18th, which I feel like is a Friday because I think I'm going to go to a Mets game that day. But September 18th is when they will reconvene in court to see about how the plea deal went. And so when they make any more noise about it, I will let you know. But for now, there's a link to some of the coverage in the show notes. It's important for me to say right up front that I barely understand the pageant world. It's not my place. So my reporting on this is really based a lot on just telling you what I read, which is unusual for me, but this is kind of an unusual story. It is about Katie Harrigan, who is a mortuary science student and the reigning Miss North Central Ohio. She's at the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science, and she's using her platform to try and normalize conversations around death and loss. Her initiative is called The Silent Subject, and it focuses on creating safe spaces for grief support as she pursues her next level, which would be Miss Ohio. And I believe Miss Ohio is then Miss America. So I feel like if you're the type of person who, or whether or not you're the type of person who roots for pageant winners, I'm rooting for Katie Harrigan, is I guess the short answer. On Deathcare and the Rest endorses Katie Harrigan for Miss Ohio and also for Miss America, assuming she wins Miss Ohio and assuming it really works like that. But there's a link to the story. It's a nice story from the Ashland source in the show notes. Because of my coverage of green burial, I also am covering a lot of Islamic cemetery controversies because they happen mainly because people just refuse to accept that Islam is a religion that has its own practices. It's always baffling to me. And there's this, story out from the Texas Monthly about the Epic Center. I shared that on social media, and I will throw it in the show notes. But this is a happy story, so I share the less than happy ones. This is a mostly happy story, but it's also a good story about why I hate NIMBYs so much, like with my core. So the Islamic cemetery that was planned in Toledo, Ohio, got tentative permission from the Toledo Plan Commission to open a natural cemetery next to their mosque in an abandoned lot that Toledo was mostly using to foment additional blight, apparently. And so, all these people came out and they're like, no, this is a great idea. And, we're going to replace this blight with a cemetery. It's going to be well kept. It's going to be beautiful. The neighbors were terrified. You mean you're going to put human bodies in the ground, but not in caskets and vaults? That means that it's going to leach in and poison the water. So the Islamic cemetery said, no, we'll have a community meeting. So they had a community meeting. 20 people showed up. And all 20 people were like, oh, well, that was really, really, really good. Thank you. I have no problem with it now that I took the time to understand it. But at the most recent meeting, people who didn't go to the thing were mad. They're like, no, they're not doing anything to educate the public. They're not doing anything to make the public involved. And this is the problem with NIMBYs. They don't want to be informed. They just want to be mad. But anyway, it looks like this will probably go through. I think this week is when they're doing one more open house for community members to come and ask questions. And I think that if you don't go to ask the questions at this point, you shouldn't be allowed to speak at the public meeting. But I also think, that people who only show up to meetings to complain and don't ever want to learn about anything should also lose their citizenship. So that's me. Anyway, link in the show notes. I've got a couple more stories that I'm not going to report on here because I'm still kind of working on them, but I'd be remiss to at least not mention Lauren Richwine, the Indiana death doula, who now is able to continue her practice after like a 3-year court battle with the state. It's complex. The law says that people can't talk about final arrangements or help people talk about final arrangements unless they're a funeral director. And the court kind of said, not in this case, but still in most cases, generally, it's against the law. So it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. And it's also, I'm going to admit now, just a little bit above my pay grade, which is why I will be speaking with Tanya Marsh, the Wake Forest law professor and, Deathcare law genius, who helps me out on lots of stories like this. So I don't know if we're going to get to do a podcast or if I'm going to write a story about it, but next week I'll hopefully have something a little bit more comprehensive on Lauren Richwine. But that will do it for this time. The Rest has been an On Death Care production. It was written, edited, all the things by me, Tony Russo. I have a blast doing it, and I have a blast doing it because of the support from my paid subscribers. As I mentioned in the beginning, please consider going to ondeathcare.com to subscribe. And if you subscribe, also maybe consider subscribing at a paid level. There are different options and different pluses and minuses for doing all of that. And as always, thank you even for taking the time to watch this. The fact that there's so much to listen to see, to read out there. Whenever I see that you guys are spending time with my stuff, it is really, really flattering, and I genuinely appreciate it. And I'm going to keep trying to earn it every week, and I hope to succeed. But until then, we'll check in with you next time.